You can support In the Past Lane by telling your friends about the podcast. Studies show that one of the top ways that people find new podcasts is by word of mouth. So please, talk it up. Thanks.
We the people of the United States, in order to form a more
to huddled masses yearning to breathe
Consider
free.
that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
that all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
And the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Hi there. Welcome to In the Past Lane, a podcast about American history and why it matters. Brought to you by SBI, Snoring Beagle International, and coming to you from the Cat in the Hat Studios, located in central Massachusetts. I'm your host, historian at large, Edward T. O'Donnell, and this is episode 183. Every week here at In the Past Lane, I tell you what happened this week in U.S. history, with special attention to one important story. So what's happening at In the Past Lane this week? Well, I just spent a fabulous weekend skiing with my college buddies. One of our crew owns a house in Maine, so we got in 2 terrific days of skiing, along with a lot of beer and recitations of the same crazy stories from long ago. We've known each other for almost 40 years. That's hard to believe, and it's amazing. I'm a very fortunate guy, that's for sure. And speaking of good fortune, this week I'm on spring break. Of course, I have a ton of things to do, but none of them involve grading papers or attending meetings. Huzzah! All right, let's get on with it. Here's what happened this week in American history. Let's start with this. On March 5th, 1770, 250 years ago this week, British troops stationed in Boston found themselves face to face with a jeering crowd of men. The soldiers had been sent to rescue one of their number who had been cornered by a crowd near the customs house. Bostonians hurled epithets and snow and ice at the soldiers, but there was nothing about the incident that suggested blood would soon flow. That changed when one of the soldiers fired his musket, likely by mistake. Immediately, his fellow soldiers, thinking an order to fire had been given, opened fire on the crowd, killing 5 and wounding 6 more. The Boston Massacre, as the incident became known, did not come out of nowhere. Tensions had been rising steadily in colonial cities like Boston at least as far back as 1765, the year the British government imposed the Stamp Act to compel the colonies to pay back some of the costs of their defense by the British military during the recently concluded French and Indian War. But the colonists, having grown accustomed to very little British interference in their affairs for most of the 18th century, erupted in protest against the act. Although the Stamp Act was repealed in 1766, Parliament followed it with the Townsend Acts of 1768, which also imposed taxes and fees. And it also touched off protests and acts of vandalism in Boston. It also led to a boycott of British goods that was organized by the Sons of Liberty. In response to these disturbances, the British government sent 2,000 troops to Boston to maintain order. For a city of just 16,000 residents, 2,000 soldiers represented a major show of force and intimidation by the Parliament. Not surprisingly, Bostonians treated these soldiers with scorn from the very start. Minor altercations on the streets between citizens, usually young tradesmen and dock workers, and the soldiers occurred frequently. By early 1770, tensions were running high. In early March, several brawls broke out between workers and soldiers. And these incidents fueled rumors of an impending crackdown by the soldiers on Sons of Liberty activity and that they also planned to cut down the Liberty Tree in South Boston. This was the essential background to what led to the events of March 5th, 1770. The Boston Massacre, as the more zealous patriots termed the clash, enraged colonists from New Hampshire to Georgia. This fury was stoked by skilled propagandists, who quickly wrote and distributed a pamphlet titled A Short Narrative of the Horrid Massacre. As the title indicates, they framed the incident not as one marked by confusion and miscommunication, but rather one where the British soldiers acted with malice and intentionally murdered the 5 victims. Paul Revere then added the final touch, an engraving that purported to show what happened on the night of March 5th, 1770. It shows a crowd of well-dressed and well-behaved Bostonians on the left being shot, as if by firing squad, by a tightly organized line of British soldiers on the right. Both the pamphlet and the image circulated widely throughout the 13 colonies. In Boston, officials moved quickly to prosecute the soldiers. The commander of the British soldiers, Captain Thomas Preston, and 8 of his men were arrested and charged with murder. Samuel Adams, a leading figure in the Sons of Liberty movement, led the prosecution, and his cousin, John Adams, defended the soldiers. Not because he sympathized with British rule, but rather because he believed that defendants deserved a fair trial. Despite raging public hostility towards the defendants, John Adams managed to convince the jury that all the conflicting eyewitness testimony they had heard meant that the defendants could not be found guilty. Preston and 6 of his soldiers were declared not guilty, while 2 others were convicted of manslaughter but soon released. And soon, despite all the fury and angry talk against British oppression, the city of Boston returned to calm, as did the rest of colonial America. The 5 victims were buried in the Granary Cemetery and then kind of forgotten. And here's where things got interesting. Many decades later, long after the American Revolution, 2 of the men became famous. All right, one of them became famous, and the other one somewhat better known. Let's start with the case of the better-known man, Crispus Attucks. Surely you've heard of him. He's the African-American man who was the first to die on the night of the Boston Massacre. Little is known of Attucks' life, except that he was likely a slave who had either earned his freedom or simply run off from his owner. In any case, he was living as a free man in Boston when things between locals and British soldiers got sticky. We know his name today because his story highlighted the contradiction at the heart of the American founding. A nation that professed to be dedicated to liberty was also the world's largest slaveholding society. How ironic, many a historian and commentator has noted, that the first blood shed in the cause of liberty was that of a man born into slavery and whose enslaved brothers and sisters represented fully 20% of the American population. But here's the thing. This observation about the significance of Crispus Attucks' death did not emerge until the 1840s and 1850s, 70 to 80 years later, when African-American abolitionists began to celebrate Attucks as an original American patriot as a way to bolster their demand for an end to slavery and the inclusion of blacks as full citizens of the Republic. And from that point forward, through the Civil War and Reconstruction, the return of white supremacy under Jim Crow, and then into the 20th century, the legend of Crispus Attucks continued to grow, as African Americans pushed for civil rights and full membership in American life. And if you want the full story about the life and legend of Crispus Attucks, check out In the Past Lane episode 79, where I speak with historian Mitch Kashoon about his book on the topic. The less well-known victim of the Boston Massacre was Patrick Carr. He was born in Ireland and later emigrated to the colonies where he took up the trade of leatherwork. The reason we know about Patrick Carr is that he was Irish. His name and story remained forgotten until the late 19th century, when Irish Americans began digging into the historical record, looking for colonial and Revolutionary War heroes. Irish immigrants, of course, did not face anything like the oppression experienced by African Americans. Nonetheless, when they began to arrive in massive numbers in the 1840s and 1850s, they were confronted by seething anti-Irish and anti-Catholic nativism. The whole Know-Nothing movement of this period was aimed at stopping the influx of Irish immigrants and making life very hard for those already here. The Irish were denounced for bringing to America crime, poverty, disease, election fraud, and godless popery. After a few decades, as an Irish-American middle class emerged, the Irish began to enjoy rising levels of income, education, and political power. But the one thing they lacked was respectability. Thus began the quest to find Irish heroes in the American past who would give the Irish a claim on American belonging. Irish-American historians discovered that 3 of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence were born in Ireland. They also touted Timothy Murphy as the hero sharpshooter who helped win the pivotal Battle of Saratoga. They likewise wrote about George Washington's favorite spy, Hercules Mulligan. And of course, they celebrated Patrick Carr for his martyrdom at the Boston Massacre. Some of these writers even went so far as to claim, without any evidence, that as an Irishman and an American, Patrick Carr had 2 reasons for hating British tyranny. These 2 stories from the Boston Massacre remind us that history has many uses, and one of them is as a tool for group advancement. African Americans and Irish Americans are hardly the only groups in America to seek acceptance by finding representative figures in the American past. German Americans, Jewish Americans, Italian Americans, you name it, have identified and celebrated people and moments in American history that reflect positively on them as early contributors to the American experiment. If you live anywhere near Boston, there are a lot of events commemorating the 250th anniversary of the Boston Massacre this week. I've posted links to them in our show page. So what else of note happened this week in U.S. history? On March 2nd, 1807, Congress passed a bill that abolished the African slave trade. Slavery, of course, was still legal, as was the buying and selling of enslaved people within the U.S. But when this law took effect on January 1st, 1808, it prohibited the importation of enslaved people from outside the U.S. Nonetheless, over the coming decades, slavery would become an increasingly important part of the American economy. March 2nd, 1877, just 2 days before Inauguration Day, with the results of the presidential election of 1876 still unclear due to voter suppression and irregularities in tallying votes in several southern states. A specially created federal commission declared Republican Rutherford B. Hayes the winner, even though Hayes had lost the popular vote. Let's just say that there were a lot of shenanigans and shady deals done behind the scenes to bring about this result. Hayes' presidency was tainted by this controversy, and his critics referred to him as his fraudulency. He lasted only one term. March 5, 1963, the Whammo Company patented the hula hoop. March 7, 1965, 55 years ago this week, Alabama state troopers attacked 600 civil rights marchers as they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. The march had been organized to demand a restoration of voting rights for African Americans. The violence of Bloody Sunday, as it came to be known, was captured on film, and it sparked outrage across the country, and efforts in Washington, D.C. that led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act just 5 months later. Other important events this week: March 2, 1962, basketball player Wilt Chamberlain scored 100 points in a single game. March 6, 1857, the Supreme Court of the United States decided the infamous Dred Scott case. And March 8th is International Women's Day. So what notable people were born this week? March 2, 1904, Theodor Geisel, also known as Dr. Seuss, was born in Springfield, Massachusetts. Geisel became a professional cartoonist and graphic designer, but in 1937 he tried his hand at writing a children's book. To Think It Happened on Mulberry Street became the first of his 60 children's books that included classics like The Cat in the Hat and Horton Hears a Who. March 3, 1847, inventor Alexander Graham Bell was born in Scotland. Bell, of course, was the inventor of the telephone, for which he received a patent on March 7, 1876. And here's a little-known fact about Bell's inspiration. Both his mother and his wife were deaf, and it was the research and experimentation he did on hearing devices that led him to develop the telephone. He also later co-founded, in 1885, the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, which we know today as AT&T. March 4, 1888, Knute Rockne was born in Voss, Norway. Rockne first earned fame as a star football player for Notre Dame University. His main claim to fame was his role in popularizing the forward pass. But Rockne is best known for the 13 years he coached Notre Dame, during which time the team won 102 games and 3 national championships. Other notables born this week: March 3, 1793, the founder of the Texas Republic, Sam Houston. March 6, 1831, Union General Philip Sheridan. And March 8, 1841, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. Okay, time for the last word. Let's give it to Theodor Geisel, or Dr. Seuss, who was born 116 years ago this week. He once said, "Nonsense wakes up the brain cells, and it helps develop a sense of humor, which is awfully important in this day and age. Humor has a tremendous place in this sordid world. It's more than just a matter of laughing. If you can see things out of whack, then you can see how things can be in whack." Well, that's going to do it for In the Past Lane this week. You can learn more about me and everything we talked about at inthepastlane.com. And let's interact via social media. I'm at In the Past Lane on both Twitter and Instagram, and our Facebook page is In the Past Lane Podcast. See you next week.
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.